Chapter 37. Flight from Sun's Blessing. Reyes concentrated on pushing forward as fast as he could. He strained his wings, trying to flap them as quickly as he could, trying to put as much distance between himself and any potential pursuit as he could. Gagara kept pace with him easily. If anything, she seemed to be coasting. For the briefest of moments, Reyes thought about ducking into the foliage of the forest. He could hide under the thick, leaf-covered branches and wait in total silence until the pursuers gave up. He thought about it, but he didn't do it. Right now, he and Gagara could be seen from Sun's Blessing. Right now, anyone pursuing them would spot where the two of them had tried to hide and would most likely find them easily. 6, Gagara commented suddenly. She had just taken a quick look over her shoulder and was now reporting what she had seen. She didn't even seem to be out of breath. 6 pursuers, Reyes called back. Flapping his wings at this pace was quite an effort. He was already panting and knew he would have to slow down before too much longer. "We have quite a lead," Gagara commented. "We do," Reyes called back, risking a quick glance over his shoulder. This split his concentration a little, causing him to slow down slightly. He could see the 6 harpies chasing them. They seemed to be spread out across the road in a kind of loose formation. The 2 outermost harpies were skimming over the trees on either side of the King's Highway. All 6 were armed. 4 of them were carrying dart throwers, while the other 2 had short bows. At the moment, they were quite a long way back, as Gagara had said, but he didn't think it would take them long to catch up. Gagara called to him, "We need to fly faster." "I'm going flat out," Reyes yelled back. "This reminds me of yesterday," Gagara called. Reyes remembered yesterday, though those pursuing them had stopped and returned to what they'd been doing as soon as they'd seen Reyes and Gagara were both female. Somehow, Reyes doubted that the same thing was motivating these pursuers. At the very least, he expected they would want to talk to the pair about Flegny's death. It was more than likely the pursuers would just assume that the 2 harpies were guilty, and would start to shoot as soon as they were in range. Reyes couldn't resist another quick glance over his shoulder. He knew it was a bad idea and that doing so would slow him down further, but he needed to see how much closer their pursuers had gotten. What he saw was a shock. In the short time since he had last glanced back, the 6 in pursuit had covered at least a third of the distance between them. "They're gaining on us," Reyes shouted worriedly. "Maybe we should turn and make a stand." "They have bows," Gagara shouted back. "They'd just use us for target practice." Reyes closed his eyes and willed his wings to beat faster still, but his wings refused to comply. He was feeling a lot of strain from the effort he was already putting into this. He was sure he was slowing down, and he was also sure he couldn't keep this pace up for a lot longer. He was certain that it would only be a matter of time, whereas at the moment they'll shoot us down the moment they get into range. "You have a point," Gagara said, once again glancing back at those pursuing them. "But we're unarmed. I left the dart thrower behind. In the end, we'd just be making things easy for them." "I have a bow, remember," Reyes called back. He showed her the hammerstone ring. "1 bow against 6, Gagara called back. "I still wouldn't give much for our chances," Reyes sighed. Gagara was right. The 2 of them would be mincemeat. Even if he still had those bracelets that Agnar had left him, his odds of defeating 6 opponents were quite low. Without those bracelets, he'd be lucky to hit even just one of his opponents. He might not be the worst shot that Sir Grant had ever taught, but he was a long way from the best. Now, if he could goad the 6 harpies into fighting him hand to hand, he might have a chance. Few were as good as he was with a blade, but somehow he doubted those chasing him would go for it. For a moment he considered giving the bow to Gagara. She was a better shot than he, a better natural shot anyway. But Gagara was the girl he loved, and she was heavy with his child. He wasn't about to ask her to risk her life if there was another alternative. He'd rather charge into the ranks of their pursuers single-handedly himself and try to buy Gagara enough time to escape. The problem there was that he was certain Gagara wouldn't go for it. She would charge in herself in an attempt to save him, and they would both get killed. Anyone else she wouldn't care about and would let them die, but he was her male, and she would try to move the heavens themselves to save him. The road turned sharply up ahead. For a couple of seconds he and Gagara would be hidden from view from their pursuers, assuming those pursuing them just followed the road. Once again the idea of ducking into the forest came to Reyes. If he and Gagara hid once they were out of sight, they might get away with it. Reyes risked another glance over his shoulder. He didn't like to do it when their pursuers were already so close, but he had to see what they were up to. As he had feared, Those chasing them had seen the bend in the road and had sent 2 of their number to cut across in front of Reyes and Gagara. Knowing it would slow him down further, but not seeing another choice, Reyes called his bow from the hammerstone. The weapon appeared in his hands with the quiver of arrows swinging loosely from it. Harpy arrows weren't really all that heavy. They were designed to be as light as it was possible to make them. Nevertheless, having the weight of 20 such arrows suddenly added to his burden while in flight, especially considering that his wings were already feeling the strain of so much effort, was quite a shock. Reyes found himself skimming down towards the road and only just managed to prevent a collision with the surface. Clumsily, Reyes prepared an arrow. He took careful aim and fired. His arrow went wide and short. The 2 harpies who had flown ahead of the rest of their pack hovered over the road up ahead. Each of them prepared an arrow to fire back, each of the 2 taking her time. They knew from experience that they weren't in range yet. "Give me the bow," Gagara called. Reyes had no argument. He handed the bow to his ladylove. The road beyond the turn began to meander a little. Reyes and Gagara flew on over the trees, trying to scoot round the 2 harpies that were lying in wait. It was here, as he began to fly about the treetops of the forest, that Reyes suddenly realised just how close to the city of Shearman he and Gagara had actually come. He wasn't sure how long it had been since the pair of them had left Sun's Blessing. It had felt like a couple of hours, but he doubted it was much more than 5 minutes. At the pace they were travelling, that had to put Shearman within a mere couple of miles of Sun's Blessing. Had he thought to fly above the treetops back at the village, then in all likelihood he would have seen the city sitting on the horizon. As it was, the forest had blocked his view of the city for most of the morning, and it was only now that he skipped across the tops of the trees that he really became aware of just how close the city was. Gagara fired. The 2 harpies that had flown on ahead with the intent to intercept them fired. No one hit. Gagara's arrow flew straight and true, but her target saw it coming and dropped low enough to avoid being struck. One of the 2 incoming arrows struck right behind Reyes and thudded itself into a tree in front of which he'd been flying a mere fraction of a second before. The second arrow must have misfired. Reyes had no idea where it went. It would take time for all the harpies to reload their bows. It was enough time for Reyes and Gagara to fly on past the 2 huntresses that had gotten ahead of them. The 2 gave chase. These 2 were the most dangerous. They were already in bow range. The other 4 behind them were still gaining on them quickly, and Reyes estimated it could only be a matter of a few seconds before all 6 would start taking pot shots at their prey. "This way," Reyes called to Gagara. An idea had come to him, and he changed direction again, flying back towards the city. Shearman was still in human hands. The residents weren't likely to take kindly to seeing a pair of harpies flying above them and terrorising the people working the farms. Gagara voiced her reservations. "Handsome? Trust me," Reyes called back. Reyes didn't feel as confident as he might have sounded. To him, it was more a case that they didn't seem to have a lot of choice. He and Gagara left the forest behind them and began to fly over the farmland that served the city. Down below he could hear the panicked screams as the people working on the farm scattered for cover. He would have loved to stop and tell them that they were quite safe from him, but he didn't have the time. He was also certain that they wouldn't believe him. As he got closer and closer to the city walls, he saw archers lining the walls as he had hoped they would. Those archers would be watching the harpies come into range and would even now be preparing to fire. Then Reyes began to realise he had miscalculated rather badly. He had had this image in his life where he and Gagara flew safely over the walls of the city, only to have the archers open fire on those chasing them. Suddenly he realised it had been no more than a wild thought. Those archers didn't know him from Lammerwort. How could they know he and Gagara were on their side? "We should climb," Gagara suggested frantically. "We need to get above the range of those archers." Reyes considered the suggestion and rejected it almost immediately. It made perfectly good tactical sense when he wasn't being chased by 6 harpies, but those harpies would just follow them up to a higher altitude. It might save Reyes and Gagara from getting shot by the humans, but they would still have 6 village harpies on their tail. Besides, he felt he had already pushed his wings beyond their normal pain threshold. It could only be a matter of time before they gave up altogether, and he just fell out to the air. When that happened, he'd rather be closer to the ground. Another thought came to Reyes. As with most land put aside for agriculture, not everything was flat. There were a fair number of small buildings scattered across the landscape in front of the city. Farmhouses, barns, cowsheds, and other small buildings, each of them with its own purpose. "Fly low," Reyes called to Gagara. It was counterintuitive. The lower to the ground the target was, the easier it would be for an archer to shoot them. Then again, Reyes was certain that harpies behind them were already in range. They probably just wanted to get a little closer first in order to be certain of their kill. Gagara didn't question him. She looked at him, a worried expression on her face, but she didn't argue. Reyes was glad she had stayed with him. Even if this was his last day, it was nice to know that Gagara had stuck by him when, had she wanted to, she could have left him behind long ago. Then Reyes saw what he was looking for. "There," he called to Gagara. It was a shed, a small wooden shed. It was dark brown in colour and was flaking in places from age. It was also in range of the archers positioned on the city walls. Extreme range, yes, but still in range. "What about it?" Gagara called back. She clearly didn't sound impressed. "Get behind it," Reyes called. "It'll protect us from the arrows of our pursuers." "What's going to protect us from the arrows of the soldiers on the wall?" Gagara called back. "Don't worry," Reyes shouted. "I've got that covered too." "I hope you know what you're doing," Gagara cried back. Then she dove for the roof of the shed. Reyes hoped he knew what he was doing too. He had to change his original plan when he realised it wouldn't work. Now he was hoping that he hadn't overlooked anything this time. He aimed to land on the ground next to the shed, only too glad that he would soon be able to rest his wings for a short while. Gagara landed first. She hit the top of the shed and then ran to the city side of it before leaping down, taking cover from those in pursuit. Evidently sensing that their prey was about to take cover, the 6 pursuers all opened fire. They left a trail of arrows in Gagara's wake, but for some lucky turn of events, not one of them struck her. Such was the power of a harpy's shot, though, that all but one of the arrows continued right on through the roof. Reyes landed on the ground next to the shadow less than a second later. Then he ducked quickly behind what cover there was, despite the fact that none of the huntresses had targeted him. Chances were they had singled Gagara out because she was still carrying the bow. Once behind the shed, Reyes realised that he and Gagara weren't the only ones there. At the first sign of the harpies flying over the fields, the peasants had scattered. Some of them had evidently sought whatever shelter they could find, and one of them had had the misfortune to choose this particular shed as a shelter. As soon as Reyes and Gagara ducked behind the shed with him, the peasant backed away quickly and turned to run. Reyes grabbed the peasant and pulled him back into the shelter of the shed. "Stay with us, it's safer." Reyes knew that the 6 harpies who were chasing him and Gagara would probably love to take potshots at some random peasant. It also occurred to Reyes that while the peasant was here with them, the archers on the walls would be less liable to shoot them. "Sssss," the peasant replied. His eyes were wide with fear. It was quite a feat for him to say as much as he did, considering the circumstances. "Handsome," Gagara said worriedly. She pointed towards the city. The archers were preparing to fire. Reyes looked quickly towards the peasant. Suddenly he didn't feel quite so confident that none of the archers would target the 3 of them. After all, what was the life of one peasant if it meant fighting back against the scourge that was the harpy? Almost without thinking, Reyes reverted to his human form. A moment later, he was clad in the armour of a knight, complete with shield. "Get behind me, both of you." Gagara acted immediately. She dove for the ground behind Reyes' legs, taking cover behind the armoured form of her boyfriend. The peasant seemed slightly less eager. Reyes couldn't blame him. The man was about to be shot at by human archers while sheltering with harpies. To the peasant, it must have seemed as if the world had turned on its head. "Get behind me," Reyes insisted to the peasant. He then crouched down behind the shed and held his shield before him to block what he could of the arrows. The peasant took one look at Gagara and froze. He wasn't going anywhere. The archers fired, and the arrows were on their way. Reyes had a mere moment to think about it. If he moved to protect the peasant, then Gagara would be left in the open. Reyes closed his eyes, but what else could he do? He was Reyes the Moth, a member of the noble family. It was part of his job to protect peasants. He extended his shield arm in an attempt to cover the peasant and stayed crouched, hoping that the armour Mangloss had given him was thick enough to fend off a flight of arrows. Considering the range involved and the fact that the archers were human, it was. A few arrows struck Reyes and bounced off his armour. Those few that did manage to pierce the outer layer of his armour got lodged in the underpadding that Reyes wore. Only 2 arrows struck his shield. It seemed that the archers had been very careful to try and avoid the peasant. Reyes' arms still felt a little sore from having to hold the shield out like that. It had been a very awkward angle, and he hadn't really been able to brace himself from the arrow's strikes. The main thing was that the peasant was still alive, and indeed unscratched. Thank you, the peasant stammered. He didn't sound too certain. Gagara and Reyes hadn't been the only targets the archers had been shooting at. Most of the arrows had flown well over their heads, over the roof of the shed, and by the sound of it, there had been more than a few direct hits on those that had been hunting them. We're alive, Gagara said, sounding a little shaky. She seemed uncertain whether or not it was safe to climb to her feet. Just about, Reyes agreed. He glanced quickly up at the walls of the city. Already, the archers lining the walls were preparing yet more arrows. Let's get round to the other side of the shed before they fire again. There was other activity at the city. A group of riders, maybe as many as 10, suddenly appeared riding through the gates. Reyes knew their intent. They were coming to finish off any harpies that still had any sign of life about them. That would most likely include Gagara, and since he had clearly been seen landing as a harpy, it would more than likely include him as well. Handsome, Gagara voiced worriedly. Go, Reyes told her. Get behind the shed. I'll catch up with you in a moment. Gagara took to the air and flew at a gentle pace over the shed. Reyes watched her go, hoping he hadn't sent her into the arms of the harpies that had chased them from Sun's blessing. He hoped that the archers on the city walls had dealt with that little problem for him. Before running round to join his girlfriend, he had something to tell to the peasant first. I have to go, but you must warn the people of the city to prepare for war. War, the peasant said, his eyes still wide. Reyes didn't plan to hang around any longer. By the look of it, the archers were already prepared to fire. He began to hurry round the side of the shed. As he ran, he shouted, The elves are coming. They'll be here not long after lunchtime. The peasant replied. Of those that had pursued Reyes and Gagara from Sun's blessing, only 2 still seemed to be capable of flying, and both of them were off in the distance, heading as quickly as they could away from the city. The other 4 all seemed to be dead, and were scattered haphazardly about. 2 of them were riddled with quite a high concentration of arrows. Now what? Gagara said. We can't just wait here for the soldiers to find us. No, Reyes agreed. We can't. He breathed deeply, took a step away from the safety of the shed, and raised the hand that bore the hammerstone ring to about shoulder height. A moment later, a sleek black horse appeared in front of him. Gagara looked disapprovingly at the horse. If we tried to ride away, the archers would just shoot us. We'd be better off flying. We can't fly, Reyes replied. In his own case, he was certain about the truth of that statement. He really needed to rest his wings before he went back into the air. If we fly, I won't be able to shield you with my armoured body. On a horse I can. Gagara seemed doubtful. Reyes glanced quickly at the height of the shed, and then at the riders in pursuit. He wasn't sure the shed was high enough to cover them when they climbed on the horse, but then again, he wasn't sure they had a lot of choice. Reyes mounted the horse. He then turned the beast so that it was facing away from the walls of the city. Thus, he was sure that when Gagara joined him, she would be shielded from the archers by his body. Once the horse was turned, he shunted himself back a little in the seat in order to make room for her in front of him. Finally, he offered Gagara his hand. I've never ridden a horse in my life, Gagara protested. It's easier than flying, Reyes replied. Come on. Only for a few minutes, then we'll get back into the air and fly wide around the city. Gagara climbed reluctantly onto the horse, looking very nervous as she did so. Don't crush my tail, will you? I'll try not to, my angel, Reyes replied. He took hold of Gagara's tail and let it rest lightly against his breastplate. Then he wrapped his arms around his love, trying his best not to hurt her wings as he did so. Reyes took hold of the reins. Then, with but a thought, he figuratively spurred the horse into action. Once again, Mangloss had been true to his word. The horse was fast. Reyes was sure that when Mangloss had given him these toys, he hadn't been expecting Reyes to make use of them to protect himself from humans. Then again, Mangloss was such a powerful wizard. Who could be sure what that old man had really had in mind when he'd made these things? As he rode, Reyes glanced grimly back at the riders. They had stopped their pursuit and were just looking on. Reyes's horse moved so fast that it must have been obvious to them that they were never going to catch up.